double bind that we have seen happening with Hillary Clinton for many, many years now, right, is can she be likable and can she be seen as competent? And we see, yes, of course.
Assuming from what you've said that people assess warmth first in men as well.
Yes.
So that's not a difference.
It's not a differentiation, but men are more likely to be able to be seen warm and competent. Yeah. But we assess, the way I've read some of this research is that the reason we assess warmth first is because it's a kind of a safety thing, right? We need to make sure that person is going to club us.
Right.
Right? Before we know whether they're capable of it. So dominant groups can be seen to have both. There is a famous case study that's been used in business schools known as the Heidi and Howard case study. And what they did was they gave a case study to groups of business students, and the protagonist was named as either Heidi or Howard in two separate case studies. Heidi or Howard was a venture capitalist who had exceptional networking skills. And this case study was given to Stanford business students, and they were asked to evaluate each of these protagonists. The only difference in the case was their name, Heidi and Howard. They were both deemed to be equally competent. However, when it came to describing their personal characteristics, Howard was described as kind, likable, and genuine. Heidi, on the other hand, was seen as aggressive, power-hungry, and self-promoting. Now, this research has shown up in all kinds of, this is a very commonly well-known business case, but there was an article that came out in Fortune magazine, it was about a year ago, and it looked at gender differences in performance reviews across 28 companies. And what it showed that in those performance reviews, fewer than 60% of men were given critical feedback, but almost 90% of women would get critical feedback, and they were much more likely to get critical feedback that was personality-based. As opposed to their competence, it was personality-based. So things like she's abrasive or strident, right? So they would much more likely for that to happen with women than with men. And so it's another example of the double bind in action. And again, it comes out as unconscious bias often when we are, and by the way, these biases are exhibited by both men and women. Women do it just as much, but it is an unconscious bias that many of us hold. So we're going to take a brief look at what are some of the gender differences in communication, because again, they do play into how we show up and how we are able to communicate presence. I want to start with this disclaimer that these are tendencies only. They are only tendencies. It would be ludicrous for me to come out here and state that 50% of the population behaves in the very same way. Of course, that's not true. So you may well see that some of these tendencies, you might fall much more under the male category than the female. And of course, all of these tendencies are on a spectrum. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, these are tendencies, and they have to do, some of the research that I looked at is based on neuroscience, but also on social science. And it looks at how boys and girls are socialized and contributes to how we behave. So you think about how often, when you've been in communication with somebody at work, does this kind of thing happen? Look familiar? So for what this cartoon illustrates is this, is that when you are communicating to anybody, whether it is your spouse, or whether it is an important client, or whether it is a partner, or whether it is your mother-in-law, the meaning of any message lies in the receiver. That means if they didn't understand what you communicated, you did not communicate. Simple as that. Hate to break it to you. So the onus is on the communicator to be able to communicate effectively with somebody else. And whether that means simplifying your language or, packaging that message in a different way, it involves to some extent understanding your audience. Now, most of the leadership behaviors which will drive communication behaviors, traditionally, when we think about leadership behaviors, we're thinking about leadership behaviors that were defined over the course of the last, let's say 50 to 100 years, as organizations were predominantly, where there was far fewer women in the workplace. And so the kinds of leadership qualities that we tended to think about were more often traits that tended to be associated with men. So things like competitiveness, aggression, that sort of thing. However, there was a study done by McKinsey a few years ago that looked at key leadership behaviors. They identified 9 leadership behaviors, and I'm not going to go through them all, but what they identified was of those 9 key leadership behaviors, 5 of them were held more frequently by women, and that 2 of them were about equally, and 2 of them were held more often by men. And what this demonstrates is that the pendulum, and you're probably experiencing this here in your own organization with the high rate of female leadership that you have, is that the traits that are required for leadership have been shifting. A couple of years ago, I was coaching a senior executive with one of our big banks here, and she was part of we do a presentation skills course that they run for senior leaders, and she was giving a presentation to her colleagues about a challenge that she was having with leadership. And this was a common exercise that they did, but her topic was different than any of the ones I'd ever heard. And what she wanted to talk about was being more empathetic and more transparent with her emotions at work, which I thought was quite a surprising leadership challenge. So I asked her about it, and she said she'd been working in the bank for 20 years, and that when she'd first come on and stepped into leadership roles, she'd been told to be more aggressive, to be more assertive, to be tougher. And that now the pendulum was swinging the other way, and she was being told to be more transparent, to be more human, to be warmer. And she said, I'm nothing, I can't be myself at work. And I said, well, what are you like at home, Karen? And she said, oh, Sarah, I cry at toilet paper commercials. And I said, well, okay, great. Let's see if we can bring a little bit of that person back to your workplace. And but she felt it to be a real challenge. So what that demonstrated to me was that the pendulum had begun to swing. So a quick look at what some of those gender styles that drive some of these leadership behaviors are. And some of these based on experiments in neuroscience that drive some of these behaviors. But in fact, a lot of this comes from research that was done in the 1990s by a linguist by the name of Deborah Tannen, you may have heard of, who looked at, as a starting place of how women and men communicate differently and how boys and girls play differently. And so some of the things in terms of gender and styles, these are just a very small sampling of some of the again, traditional differences in how we show up and how we behave. So the first one is about risk. There's often a misperception that women are risk averse. And there's a lot of research done now, especially in the financial world, when we're talking about investments, because women hold a lot of wealth these days. And so there's a lot of research being done about how women make investments. Women are not, in fact, risk averse, but women do tend to manage risk more carefully. They will want to ask a lot more questions. They will want to look at things from many different angles. And so they want to take more informed risks at a slower pace. An example that's often shown that's often bandied about in the financial world is of the iconic Wall Street firm, the Lehman Brothers, who were at the center of the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009. And there was speculation at the time that if there had been, that they had taken a lot of quite extreme risk in the case of that particular bank. There was a lot of speculation that if there had been a few more Lehman sisters at the table, they might not have gotten into the trouble that they did. There might have been more challenging of some of the risks that they were taking. So women are more likely to take risk that is mitigated, that is balanced, that is managed, that is more thoughtful, that it tends to be slower, whereas men are more likely to pursue risk. Multitasking. Some of you might relate to this. In fact, our brains can only do one thing at a time, but there is some research that shows that women can sequentially task much more quickly. This may have an evolutionary basis in that when we were living back in caves, we had to tend the fire and also watch the toddler at the same time. So I had an example of this in my own life not too long ago. We have a calendar in my kitchen where we keep everything that is happening in the household. I was in a period of doing a lot of traveling for work, and my son had a very busy schedule with his hockey. And so my husband came up the stairs to check something on the hockey schedule on the calendar, and I turned to him and I asked him a question that had to do with my travel that was coming up. And he turned to me and he just glared at me and he said, "Sarah, how can you expect me to listen to you when I am holding a thought in my mind?" Our friends call him Single Task Bob, because he's a single tasker. So, example of the multitasking. Building consensus, seeking input. Women tend to build more consensus before making decisions, tend to ask a lot of questions. Men are more likely to see those kind of questions as a competitive one up, one down. If we think about how girls and boys play in the playground, girls are more likely to play with one or two friends, have a best friend or maybe a couple of best friends. Who is your best friend? Your best friend is the person you tell your secrets to.
That is how we determine friendship. Boys are more likely, again, more likely, to play in larger groups, to play competitive games. It is not, there is no stigma for a boy to be seen as the leader in the group, whereas girls will be more likely to be seen, even though they will certainly be strong leaders, you will not want to be seen to be a show-off or to think you're too important. Right? So different importance placed on power and this idea of one up and one down. Deborah Tannen, one of the things that she found she got the most feedback in one of her books about was the idea of one up, one down, and the stereotype that we have about men not wanting to ask for directions. The reason she theorized that men do not like to ask for directions is that it puts them in a one down position to indicate that I don't know where I'm going and I have to ask a stranger. And that stranger might not know the right answer either. Right? So, whereas women do not tend to think that way. Women tend to talk to reduce stress. Men resolve stress by action. So I had a guy, I was teaching a difficult conversations course a couple of years ago, and I had a senior guy who was in my class come to me at the end of the day and tell me about how much he had learned. And his name was Joseph. And I said to him, well, that's great, Joseph. I'm glad you had a good day. Let me know how things are going with your team. And he said to me, oh, Sarah, I'm not talking about my team. I'm talking about my wife. And what he told me about was that what I realized that he would do is he'd go home at the end of the day. His wife would come home. She'd have a problem at work that she wanted to talk about, and she would start telling him about the problem, and he'd have a solution, and he'd have an idea and help her how to solve the problem. And she'd say to him, I don't want you to solve my problem. I just want you to listen. And he could not understand this. And what it is actually shown is that for women, it actually releases serotonin for us to talk about problems. It calms us. It makes us feel de-stressed. Women are more likely to internalize problems, to see problems that are existing either in our work or with our clients as something that has to do with us. Men are more likely to see those problems as being external. An example of this, I had a friend a couple of years ago who was she and her husband were in a custody battle with his ex-wife about his child. They lost the battle. The child stayed with his mother in the U.S. And they were quite devastated, as you can imagine. And she kept, ruminating about this. What could we have done differently? And her husband's response was, there's a problem with the system. So for him, the problem was external. For her, it was internal. Final thing is emotions. That women tend to see emotions as being an indication of passion, and men can see emotions, particularly vulnerable emotions, as an expression of weakness. All right, so again, these are generalizations, but again, you may look at this list and you think, I fall completely on the male side, and there's nothing wrong with that. What we want to consider when it comes to things like how we communicate is when we behave in ways that are contrary to our gender, what kinds of impact is there? Because sometimes there is. Sometimes we are punished for behaving in ways that do not correspond with assumptions that people may make about how women should behave, or how men should behave is the flip side of that. So here's a few examples of some of the ways that these show up in communication. Women are more likely to see apologies as a ritual smoother, as a way to just smooth out a conversation. I had this happen a few months ago where I was meeting with a client. Some of you are laughing in recognition over there. You know this? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. You apologized already to me today. That's right. You did. So I was meeting with a client, and I was meeting her at her office, and she'd given me the wrong directions to get there. She gave me the wrong address. So I showed up late. When I got there, she apologized for the wrong directions at the same time as I apologized for being late. Neither one of us really cared who was wrong, right? But it was a way to smooth out the awkwardness of the situation, which is that, I was late. So women are more likely to accept an apology as that kind of a ritual smoother. Men are more likely to accept apology at face value. You're accepting responsibility, you're expressing regret. So that's one example. Another example is questions. Women will tend to ask more questions, not necessarily because we don't know the answer, but because it's an indirect way sometimes of making a statement. It's a way of seeking input. It's a way of collaborating, and it's often a way of managing risk, particularly if we're trying to raise a red flag about something that we're not sure about. Asking a question is a way of showing warmth. But what it can do sometimes, in some instances, it may undermine perceptions of our competence. Again, not always. Men are more likely to see asking questions, a lot of questions, as demonstrating a lack of knowledge or a lack of confidence. And the final one we'll take a look at is this idea of language. Women tend to be more indirect in our requests, our statements, our directives, which is why they are sometimes misinterpreted by men who will hear something indirect as being, they won't hear it as an instruction. Women are likely to build rapport through praise, through flattery, through humor sometimes. Men are more likely to build rapport through banter. Anybody familiar with this idea of trash talk as a thing that happens in sports? Yeah, so it's something where men make fun of each other, mock each other quite like unbelievably harshly in some cases as a way sometimes of building rapport and sometimes of psyching each other out. So we'll take a look at that idea in a moment. Now, this is here on the theme of communication. This is a cartoon that is about over 50 years old from a New Yorker cartoon. And it still elicits laughs of recognition even 50 years after it was published. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, like, you know, maybe this is not something that has happened in your day-to-day reality. Maybe, yeah, okay, so, okay. All right, so maybe not. So there are many reasons for this. We don't know what actually happened before Ms. Triggs made her suggestion. So there are many, many things to consider here. It is possible she may have made her suggestion as a question. Should we be considering a different direction for this project? Right? It is an indirect, questioning way to make a suggestion. So it may not have been heard as a suggestion by the men in the room. She may have been interrupted by one of the men. Men are less likely to see interruption as a form of rudeness. Women tend to take interruption more personally. And another thing is when you think about this idea of competition, men are more likely, when an issue has been raised in a room, someone has made a suggestion, I'm going to take that suggestion and I'm going to add a little something to it, and now it's my idea, and I'm going to run with it, like the ball in football. It's my idea now. No recollection or even really awareness that somebody else had raised this idea. Interestingly, when it comes to that theme, this has been something I read about recently about Barack Obama up until in the beginning of his first term, had very few women in his senior staff. And that the women who were around the table were finding that the same thing was happening, that either they were not being heard or that their ideas were being voiced by somebody else and then taken credit for. So they began a process that they called amplification. And it was a very, very simple process. What they would do, you read about this? Yeah. So one woman would make an idea, another woman would repeat the idea, credit the woman who had just made the idea, and then that woman would be acknowledged for it. And what they found was that women would start to be called on at the table more frequently and began to have a louder voice and a more prominent presence. Very simple, right? A very, very simple strategy. So I'm going to look at this idea. I mentioned this idea of trash talk. And the reason I mentioned it is because what often happens is when women are sent to things like assertiveness training, and this is an approach to addressing some of these biases and imbalances, is that women get sent to things like assertiveness training. How do you survive in a male-dominated world is you behave more like a man. I think that's the crux of assertiveness training. And my feeling about that is that that's really an approach that's about fixing women, and women don't really actually need fixing. That said, very often when we find ourselves trying to take on behaviors that don't feel authentic, that don't feel true to what we really, to our natural style, it can not only feel authentic, it can sometimes really come off as inauthentic, sometimes even ridiculous. And here is an example of that. This is, women tend to have a different approach to insults. We take insults literally as insults. Men are more likely to take insults as a form of relationship building. I had a woman in a conference I spoke at 2 years ago who talked about, we talked about this idea of trash talk, and she said, oh, my boss does that. And this was someone who worked in sales. She said, he keeps a whiteboard on his office wall with all the best insults of all the senior sales reps when they come in. And he rates which ones are the best, which I thought was horrifying, but he thought was hilarious. So trash talk can be a way of building rapport. However, when you'll see here, when we see the women's soccer team, this is Katie Nolan asking the U.S. soccer team to trash talk. So here they are.
the show obviously is called Garbage Time, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to let you and some of the other ladies trash talk. I just want you to look right into the camera and tell Australia what's up. I'll be your muscle.
Hi, Australia.
Hey.
Well, we're gonna beat you.
First game, Australia. We're coming in. We're gonna come in hot. We're gonna come in hot. It's gonna be a good game. They're a great team. I have a few friends.
Worst trash talk I've
few
ever heard.
friends on the team.
I don't do that.
What?
If the game doesn't go as planned, you know, and then you're like talking trash and talking, you know, the
Right.
smack.
Is there a thing in the world you don't like?
I could probably think of some things.
Cockroaches? You
Like
too.
them, don't like them. Smack them with the broom. Get them out.
You're out.
You're
Can you
out,
just edit this to make it look like she's talking about Australia? Is that great? You're going to play Australia first.
Smack them with the broom. Get them out.
What about Sweden?
Let's see. Oh wait, hold on. Game face. Hey, Sweden.
What's up?
Game on June 12th. It's coming around the corner.
Around the corner. It's like a hype man, right? That's what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
blah.
so not good at garbage time. I should have prepared for this.
All right, so a little over the top, but it illustrates the idea that when we try to embody behaviors or take on behaviors that are not authentic, they can seem ridiculous, right? And this is an extreme example of kind of a very typically male behavior that's been adopted by these athletes. All right, so these differences, and again, they are tendencies only, in gender differences have an impact on how we communicate, and therefore they have an impact on how we are perceived. So if we try too hard to stretch ourselves across the spectrum to another kind of behavior, we can be seen as inauthentic, probably not as ridiculous as that, but we can be seen as inauthentic, and it can certainly feel inauthentic. And it often doesn't work. So we're going to take a look at what actually does work. So that's some of the systemic some of this kind of systemic and social ways, things that can get in our way. We'll take a look just very briefly right now at some of the internal things that can get in our way. There are internal barriers too. So I have observed in the course of my work over the last 15 years, women who wait for the right moment to do something that feels uncomfortable, to ask for promotion, to ask for a raise, to ask for a stretch assignment, to go after be assigned to work with a particularly large client. It comes, this desire to wait very often comes out of that innate desire, as we talked about earlier, to manage risk, right? I don't want to expose myself to too much risk, so I'm going to make sure I've got all my bases covered. That when we do actually take those leaps into something that feels outside of our comfort zone, or it feels like a little bit of a stretch, we may get that feeling of imposter syndrome. Some of you are nodding. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you have suffered from imposter syndrome, but I'm going to guess that for most of us, it comes up from time to time. And it comes up in all kinds of different ways. So I want you to think about, when are some of those ways that you might feel that you suffer from imposter syndrome? Are they the times when you have to raise a red flag? When you're talking to senior partners, let's say, you have to raise a flag about a problem with a particular file. Are they times when you need to, you don't understand the instructions that you've been given, and you need to ask questions, and you have to decide, do I ask these questions now, or do I go and talk to my colleague and find out what actually that partner actually meant, right? And there may be all kinds of other situations where we feel that discomfort, that lack of confidence, and maybe we're communicating with a client and we have to present some information, and we are nervous about doing it. So these are all of a small sampling of the kinds of moments where we might feel that self-doubt, where we're having some kind of a stretch outside of our comfort zone. Before we talk a little bit any more further about confidence, I'm going to give you a little stretch assignment to do right now, and it will not be painful. Not too painful, a little bit painful maybe. You'll see on the table in front of you, you'll see there's some blank paper. I'm going to ask you to just take a piece of paper
And then once you have a piece of paper, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you, and you are going to partner with that person for about 2 minutes. So it's not a lifetime relationship. Those of you at the table in Ottawa can do the same. All right, what I'm going to invite you to do right now is this. Take that piece of paper, take a pen, take a good look at the person you're sitting with, and what I'm going to give you is 1 minute, and you are going to draw that person. Okay? Then all the better. All the better. Okay? So, 1 minute, start drawing. All right, you got 30 more seconds, so finish up, make it pretty. You're done? Yeah, for each of you, so you're going to, both of you should have drawn now. Yeah, you should be doing it at the same time. If that wasn't clear, if you haven't drawn, one person hasn't drawn, draw now. What are you doing over here? These are good. Oh, well, that's good. Yeah, it's got a body and hair and hands and feet even. Oh, yeah, and she has hands and feet and hair too. That's perfect. Oh, that's pretty good. All right. Oh, yeah, these are looking good. Okay. So you got about another 10 seconds, so finish that up. If your person doesn't have any eyes yet, you should give them some. All right. Now what I'd like you to do... Oh, that's a perfect likeness. Okay, now what I'm going to invite you to do is take that picture and give it to that person as a gift. Okay, so a lot of you are fixing your hair right now. I don't know why that is. Okay, so I'm curious to know what kind of things did you hear your partner saying to you as they gave that to you, or did you hear yourself saying as you gave that picture? Yeah. I'm sorry. How many of you apologized? Okay. How many of you said, I really can't draw? What other kinds of things did you say? Doesn't look anything like you. You're much prettier. I heard someone say that. You're much prettier than I. Yeah. Okay. So what's that? Not enough time. I didn't have enough time. Yeah. It's not my fault. It's like it's the exercise. It's Sarah's fault. Yeah. You can blame me. Okay. So what we heard here, when you probably, as you were doing this exercise, if you weren't talking out loud and giving voice to these feelings, what you were hearing in your mind was this voice of, maybe not quite as far as the imposter syndrome, but there was a voice in your head telling you what a lousy job you were doing, right? And hence you felt compelled to apologize. Now, it's interesting because I'm going to show you something before we show you that. This is a concept that we talk about as being the inner critic, or sometimes as the ego. So I can show you. I flashed this up here for a second. I'm going to show this to you again. This is a drawing that was also done, and this time it's a little bit X-rated. So before I show it to you, if you're concerned about that, you might want to look. There it is. All right. This is a drawing of my family done by my 5-year-old son. And he presented to his kindergarten teacher. with pride, by the way, and said, "This is my family on our winter holiday, and everybody is naked." So I was a little worried when she told me this, that she's next going to tell me that she's calling Children's Aid and wondering what we were doing over our holiday. But we spent our holiday in Winnipeg, and I will tell you, we spent as little time naked as possible. It was very cold. And so my son presented, and he explained it in quite graphic detail, which I won't go into, but he presented this with a lot of pride, this picture, which is kind of unrecognizable. Now, what this tells us is that at one point in our lives, we all thought we could draw, right? And this is a learned behavior over time that we realize that, this is somewhere along the way we learned that we're not good at that. And so what we are hearing in our minds is what I call the inner critic, sometimes known as the inner critic. The inner critic is the voice that we hear when we are experiencing that imposter syndrome. And that inner critic is a voice that is often anxious, harsh, very repetitive, doesn't give really any reasons or justification for its criticisms of you, but just tells you over and over again how you're not good enough for this, you're not ready for this, it's that whatever the case may be. And will often present itself as being the voice of reason. Now, the interesting thing about the inner critic is, and this is known by many different words in psychology, it's sometimes known as automatic distorted thinking, the ego, but the inner critic is really there for a purpose. And it is there to be, as I think of it, the guard at the edge of your comfort zone. The inner critic is there to protect you from humiliation, from taking unnecessary risks. And we talked earlier about this idea that women manage unnecessary risk. We are cautious about, tend to be more cautious about risk, more thoughtful about it. And we tend to ruminate on problems. We tend to internalize things. So we are more prone to hearing this inner critic repeatedly on a kind of broken record. It's not that men don't experience this too, they certainly do. But women are more prone to manage risk, so we're more likely to hear this voice over and over. Now, we can't banish this voice entirely, but we can do some things to quiet it. We can, first of all, notice that it is even happening. We can look for evidence that this voice is in fact right, because the voice will not give us evidence, right? So if we're talking about speaking up in a particular way that feels out of our comfort zone, that we feel that something terrible is going to happen, we can look for evidence to see how likely that actually is. We can see the positive motives of that inner critic, that it is there, in fact, to protect us. And we can acknowledge them and thank them and say, actually, I've got this one covered. I'm going to do this anyway. And the more we can give ourselves that kind of positive messaging, the less likely we are to obey, to be slave to that inner critic. Now, the reason this is relevant to me is that because I think very often what I've been found over many, many years now of coaching people about their communication and in particular about their presence is that very often people say, I'm going to do that, or when I feel confident. Or I just really want to get confident. What I want to do with you today here is get confident. And I feel like confidence is really a moving target. That confidence is always out of reach, and that we tend not to have confidence with anything really 100% until we've done it before, until we have mastery. Whereas courage, I find to be a more useful framework. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to draw this picture because I've been told I'm a team player. I'm going to go ahead and do this. We're going to push ourselves. That takes courage to push ourselves out of our comfort zone. Courage can draw on reserves of previous positive experiences. It can be bolstered by the support of others. And we can proceed with courage even if we don't feel 100% confident. So I feel that this quest for confidence that we often hear a lot about is kind of overrated. And when we are looking at our communication and our sense of presence, oftentimes what we will need to do to be able to embody a real sense of presence is to step outside of our comfort zones, which I know is what a lot of us smart people in the room don't really like to do. Right? We like to stay where we know we're looking and feeling pretty good. So on the notion of presence, what is it? What does it actually mean? I'll share a story with you about a young woman who was known to really embody presence. And this was a story of a young leader. In the time of the story, she was only a teenager, but she worked in her family business, and she was set to take over this family business and had the opportunity to head up this very successful enterprise. However, she was kicked out of the family business after a falling out with her brother, and she had to go and live in another part of the country, in fact, and she didn't know how she was going to get back in and what she was going to do, and it was very traumatic for her. So after soliciting the support of a very powerful competitor, she was able to persuade him to partner with her, and they ended up not only becoming extremely powerful together, but they achieved almost entire world domination. Who I'm talking about is this woman, Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is often known, when we think about Cleopatra, many of us will think about her having been renowned for her beauty and her sexuality. And in fact, there are very few historical references to Cleopatra's beauty. What there are many, many references to are her voice and her speech and her powers of persuasion. She was, in fact, rigorously schooled in the art of rhetoric, how to persuade, and she was schooled in how to modulate her voice, how to use gestures, from the time she was a small child up until, adulthood at the age of 17. So she knew how to make an argument, she knew how to communicate it clearly, and she knew how to be engaging and how to make connections with other people, which is how she ultimately persuaded Caesar to become her ally. So she, to me, really embodies this idea of presence. Even though, unfortunately, we don't have any videotapes of her in action, this is what history tells us about Cleopatra. So when we're thinking about what is this idea of presence that we kind of hear a lot about these days, it's kind of a trendy idea. I did some looking at a very famous voice teacher in the theater. His name is Patsy Rodenberg. And what she talks about is 3 circles that, as a way of thinking about presence. And it has to do with how we give off our energy to other people. And the first one is first circle. So first circle is when we are focused inward. We make ourselves small. We make our voice small. We keep our energy to ourselves. We're quiet. Our breath is short. When we are people who tend to live a lot in first circle, we are often people who feel like we are being ignored or not heard. People might often ask us to repeat ourselves. Can't hear us. We feel self-conscious. Flipping to the other extreme is what Patsy calls third circle. And these are people who are the performers. There's somebody in the media a lot these days who might come to mind, who shall remain nameless, who really embodies this. Where the energy is focused outward, it's not very specific, but it's about just sending a lot of energy out, look at me, wanting to take in attention, being performance-seeking, attention-seeking, being loud, taking up a lot of space. Now, sometimes we need to be in third circle, like if we need to cut through a crowd, for example, or we need to get somebody's attention across a room. But it's not a space in which we really make connections with others. The circle where we have presence is the second circle, and that's when we are focused outward, but we are making genuine, true connections with other people. Second circle kind of energy requires real engagement. It requires that we make eye contact, that we are listening, deeply listening to other people, that we are curious about other people's experience, that we are taking the time to ask questions and really listen to the responses, as opposed to talking a lot because we want to appear like we're smart or like we know what we're talking about. When we are in second circle, and we're in that presence space, we are able to acknowledge other people's feelings and we're able to be present with them. So I'm going to look at the nonverbal and the verbal elements of presence. And I'm going to start with the nonverbal because they are the ones that tend to be more subtle. There's a lot of research around about nonverbal communication and how much of our communication, in fact, is nonverbal. And there's some groundbreaking research that was done in the 60s that was known as the Morabian study that looked at how much of our communication was nonverbal. And that research has been distorted many times. But what in a nutshell, it said was that up to 60%, sometimes even higher, of our communication is nonverbal. It's not with our words. And if you think about this, human beings are hardwired after thousands of years of evolution to communicate with our whole being, right? If you think about if you have to have a difficult conversation with somebody, you probably want to have it in person, unless you want to break up with somebody by text or anybody's ever done that. I'm not asking for any show of hands or anything. But most of the time we want to have difficult conversations in person. If we have to have an important conversation at work with a partner, with a client, we need to have that conversation in person because we intuitively know that we need to read their body language. We need to read their facial expression. We need to hear their voice. I'm going to guess that most of us in the room have had a significant misunderstanding by email at some point in our lives, if not in the last week. Right? Because email, all we have is our words. Body language governs the way other people perceive us. That is well known. But it also governs, to some extent, how we feel about ourselves. Your body shapes your mind, and your mind shapes your behavior. So I'd like everybody to just take a moment right now, without moving, to take a bit of an audit of how your body language is right now. How are you sitting? Just take a moment to notice. Some of you may be, sitting, looking at yourselves. You maybe have your arms crossed. Maybe you're feeling a little cold. Right? There's no judgment on any of these things, but I want you just to notice it. Our body language will not only impact on how other people interpret us, but how we actually feel about ourselves. And I'm going to share with you a quick video by Amy Cuddy, who's a behavioral psychologist at Harvard, who'd had a TED Talk about the notion of body language. And she did some very interesting research about this. We tend to think about what is my body language communicating with you, and vice versa, what is it communicating with me? And Amy Cuddy has taken this a step further. So let's have a listen to what she has to say.
So we're really fascinated with body language, and we're particularly interested in other people's body language. We're interested in, an awkward interaction, or a smile, or a contemptuous glance, or maybe a very awkward wink, or maybe even something like a handshake.
Here they are arriving at number 10, and look at this lucky policeman gets to shake hands with the President of the United States. Oh, and here comes the Prime Minister of the... No.
There's a similar incident that happened here in Canada a couple of weeks ago with our Prime Minister and little Prince George. Did anybody see that? Tried to give that kid a high five? Nope. Did not fly. It went, that news went viral around the UK. So body language communicates a lot. The judgments that we make about other people's body language can sometimes have, impacts that we're not even aware of about the assessments that other people make about us. Now, Amy Cuddy's research showed that what she wanted to determine was not only did body language, how did other people interpret it, but how did it make us feel? Did it have an impact on how we felt in the world, and therefore how influential we could be? And so what she looked at was the animal kingdom. And what she and her team looked at was what animals do when they are feeling dominant and when they're feeling submissive. And what they found, of course, we can think about this, is that when we are feeling dominant, when animals are feeling dominant, they make themselves big, right? And when they're feeling submissive, they make themselves small. And what they studied in their research was something that they called power posing. And what they would have people do was to take on power poses where people would make themselves big in various different ways. And then they would have them spit into a cup, and they would test their saliva. And they would find that those people who were doing the power posing would have an increase in testosterone, and a decrease in their cortisol. An interesting thing that I noticed a couple years ago was that there was this phenomenon that was happening on public transit systems in the U.S., in particular in New York City, and this particular campaign was called Stop the Spread Dude. And it was about how was targeting men who would take up more space than they needed on the subway. And that, I reasoned that this may have had something to do with this idea of power posing, that it makes us feel dominant when we take up more space. Now, I'm not suggesting that we start, standing like this when it comes to a meeting. But what I am going to invite you to do right now is to stand up for a moment, and we're going to do some power posing together. And you may or may not notice the difference. But there's two power poses we can try. Amy Cuddy calls this an easy life hack. That it's a very simple way to change how you feel by changing your body language. So there are 5 power poses that she identified. The easiest one to do, the standing one, is she didn't call it this, it dubbed this as Wonder Woman. And it involves standing with your feet spread apart and your hands on your hips. The next level is this one, which I call the starfish, which is your arms up. We're going to hold this for 2 minutes. So if you can't hold your arms up for that long, you might want to just go with Wonder Woman. So what she found was that they did a series of interviews, and they had a control group who could stand who could sit however they wanted before the interview, and then they had another group that did power posing. And they set them up in this very challenging interview situation. And what they found was that this was a job interview situation, that overwhelmingly those candidates who had been doing their power posing beforehand were the ones that the panel wanted to hire. Now, if you think about how when you're going in for an interview, if anybody can remember the last time they went for one, how we're likely to stand is probably something that's more aligned with how many of you were sitting before, which is, you make yourself small, right? Sit like this, maybe we're checking our phones, right? This is how we tend to sit when we are going in for, whether it's a job interview or it's an important meeting, a situation that makes us feel anxious. The power posing was shown, as I said, to increase your testosterone and lower your cortisol. So you be less reactive, but have a sense of being more powerful. So I am not suggesting, again, that you go into your meetings like this. That would be ridiculous. However, what I do recommend is that when we are in those kinds of situations, that we stand as much as possible, that we sit up, that we hold our shoulders back, we keep our chest open, that we not be afraid to take up a little bit of space. It makes us feel better. And in fact, it will communicate a sense of power as well. I don't want to go so far as this, because this is a little bit too dominant. Unless you're a certain politician in the United States who shall remain nameless. But that's why these kinds of gestures tend to be, come across as very, very aggressive. Okay, I think that's 2 minutes, and you can sit. Notice if you have any change in your behavior. All right, how you feel. We're not going to go too much into depth here, you'll be glad to know, because I have many, many exercises we could do here about voice and vocal expansiveness. But there are 5 ways that we think about expressing ourselves vocally that we look at when we're doing this kind of coaching and this kind of work. And they are pace, pause. Pace is the speed at which you speak, but pause is about taking a space between ideas. Pitch is having variation in pitch, projection, of course, being loud enough, and pronunciation. What Amy Cuddy's research showed was that even a sense of vocal expansiveness communicated a feeling of power. There was an article written in 2008 in the Globe and Mail that I clipped out and I sometimes use in teaching called, that studied the pace at which prominent politicians spoke. And the researchers, the Canadian researcher, measured how fast people spoke. And this was during the Democratic primaries in the US when Obama and Hillary Clinton were running. And they measured the words per minute that people spoke. And what the title of the article was, Turtle Talk Wins the Race. That people who speak more slowly are perceived as having gravitas, are perceived as having confidence, are seen as people who know what they're talking about. I would say the number one thing I coach people on in my work is speaking too quickly. Most of us speak too quickly when we are nervous, when we're worried about time constraints, when we have a lot of content to get through. Most people tend to speak too quickly. I myself tend to speak too quickly. Speaking slowly, that sense of vocal expansiveness can communicate gravitas, and it can also help us to think more clearly, and it really contributes to that sense of presence. Next piece is eye contact, making real eye contact with people. We tend not to make eye contact because we are afraid that people will not want to make it with us, or we're worried about what we're going to see if we actually look at them. In North America, we make eye contact in conversation. We probably all know this intuitively. It's not true across cultures. There are many cultures that do not privilege eye contact as a form of communication. But again, we want to have eye contact that is connected, that is real, and that is engaging other people across the table. We touched on the nonverbal elements of communication, and now we'll spend a little time on the verbal. And there are 3 guiding principles here to verbal communication. The first is about simplicity. And we'll take a look at the case against jargon. And I know that you're probably very, very heavy into jargon in your world. That said, when we are in verbal communication in particular, jargon does not land well on our ears. There's a book I sometimes refer to, I have it on my shelf at home, that was written a number of years ago by a group of recovering Deloitte consultants. And it was called Why Business People Speak Like Idiots. And it's about how business speak and jargon so often obscures meaning in communication. And I know that can be a real issue when we are communicating with clients who do not understand legal concepts, or they may not understand them when they hear them. So we want to use language that is warm, that engages the feelings. People often make decisions based on emotional responses rather than rational responses, or at least there's a combination of both. And to use language that is visual and concrete. How can we paint a picture? Either by describing a situation or by giving an example, particularly when we're trying to illustrate concepts that are highly technical or complex and that may not be clearly understood by our listener. Things that we want to watch out for. Talked about jargon already. This idea of minimizers, disclaimers, and apologies. Talked earlier about this idea of warmth versus competence. Very often, one way that women, in particular, although I hear men do it too, make a bid for warmth is through some of these things, the minimizers, disclaimers, and apologies in particular. We don't want to be seen, we know unconsciously that we don't want to be seen as too harsh, so we will apologize, we will minimize, we will use language that softens the message that we have to deliver. And we have good intentions when we do this. It's not, and again, it's not always conscious. Often it's not conscious, but that it can undermine our credibility, and it can certainly undermine that sense of presence that we want to convey. Quick example here of jargon. I have a colleague who often refers to the notion of $10 words, using a $10 word when a $1 word will do. And this is a video from The Daily Show, which some of you probably see. And this is all you need to know really about this video is that this was a sketch that they used to do a lot, where they would send comedians out into the world posing as reporters to interview newsmakers of the day, and the joke was on that person because they thought this was a real reporter. That's all you need to know.
Tax law basically says that any gifts or any prizes, awards, things like that, is taxable to you.
So if I was given a cupcake, I would have to pay taxes on the cupcake?
One cupcake would be considered de minimis.
De minimis? What the is that?
It just means it's very small, it's immaterial. So
why didn't you just say that?
Thought it sounded good.
Well, it didn't sound good.
You laugh, but how many of you have ever used the word de minimis? So it's an example of a word that means something very, very particular, right? It's Latin too, which is, kind of really extra fancy. But that it can obscure meaning, right? It can obscure meaning, and it doesn't always make us sound smart, particularly in verbal communication. What we communicate on the written page is different. When we are communicating something in written form, the reader can take a moment to read that, reflect on it, think about what it might mean, have a pause, go back to it. When we are receiving information auditorily, we don't have that luxury. So we need to be able to land quickly. And the way that information lands most quickly is if it is conversational and human. And so words like de minimis, unfortunately, even though it is a great and fancy word, does not do that. So using jargon and using complex language takes away from our sense of presence. The last thing we'll look at is this idea of minimizers and apologies. Minimizing in weak language. And again, these are things that we do unconsciously. We do it often in verbal language, but also in written language as well. I'm going to show you an example here of an email. And I have bolded some of the tentative or apologetic language. So take a moment to look at that and see if that sounds at all like you. And here is that sound. So what you can see here is with some of this apologetic language, this tentative language, is that again, this kind of language is something that we do, I believe, unconsciously as a bid for connection, as a way to express warmth. We know unconsciously that if we come across too strong, too harsh, we will be
not liked, right? And that can have consequences. It's not always important to be liked, but sometimes it can have real consequences, particularly when relationships are important. And really, when are they not? So we unconsciously will make these adjustments as a way of softening our message. That said, we can make those adjustments in other ways. So we can start positive, we can be upbeat, we can communicate warmth while still being direct and to the point, and by removing any of that apologetic language. What I will challenge you to do when you're done here today is to go to your computer, to your phone, and look at your sent box and take a look at, do a little audit of your emails in the last week. For those of you who are smiling and nodding and thinking this might be me, take a look at which of those emails you may have sent out that may have had some of this kind of language in them.
A couple of years ago, someone at a session like this said that one way to minimize tentative language was to remove I from the email and start using you. You asked me for this proposal after your presentation, which was fantastic, by the way. Please find it enclosed.
Yeah.
How does that jive with the research that you've been reviewing?
It's something that I will often advocate that people do. I have another slide, another deck that shows examples of exactly that. When we are communicating with others, in particular when we're communicating in formal settings, like a presentation, for example, or a meeting, we'll often want to start with that kind of thing, I language, because it's what I feel comfortable with. I know what I can tell you about myself, right, and about my firm or whatever, but I don't know so much about you, right? When we put things in, and so what can tend to happen when we default too much to that is it sounds like this presentation or this talk or this email or whatever is all about me. And when I put things in you language, it's suddenly about the receiver. And so it becomes more accessible to me as the receiver. And it is a way of, I'm not sure if I would say it's probably a way that builds relationship and communicates warmth. Yeah. Well, don't overdo it, right? Especially if it's not like you ask for this and you ask for that, and it doesn't, because that can start to sound a little bit accusatory, right? Does that answer your question, Mary?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No. All right. So, in closing, we looked at some of the very high level differences in gender in terms of how men and women communicate. And that when we are communicating, particularly with people who are different from us, whether it is through gender, through culture, through position, through life experience, one thing that can be useful is to clarify our meaning and to be sure that we are communicating in a way that our receiver will be able to understand. To notice also our own bias when we're dealing with others. And I will add to that to look for opportunities to amplify each other. When we are thinking about taking risks, I will encourage you to take a step away from this I think, fruitless quest for confidence, and instead reframe that and think about how can I harness my courage. And finally, when we're looking at these elements of presence, how do we communicate it? That these are small nudges, they're small ways that we can tweak our own behavior that can have significant impact on how we are received and how we are seen. Small things like slowing down, like taking a little bit more space, like finding different ways to express warmth than through apologies and minimizers. So I have a couple of minutes for questions, and if we don't have any questions, I'll release you. Yes?
I actually have a question. You're talking about voice, and I thought I would pass along a tip that was given to me when I was a junior associate that I've kept, and some of you already heard me practice a little speech on before. But what I find with women in particular, we spend a lot of time talking and a lot of time on the phone, is that women's voices tend to go up, right? And what was told to me by one of the senior partners here at the time said you need to be very careful about your tone. And when you're talking to people and you're giving advice, if your voice goes up, it sounds like you're not confident. Yeah. So to think about the level of your voice, and I actually have to, because my voice always went up, I was one of those people, I have to think consciously about making my voice go down. Yeah. And that way, and it's true, because the advice is better received from the client when you, and how you present it.
Thank you. What's your name?
Victoria.
Victoria. Thank you, Victoria. What you're referring to is what I call upspeak. And it's when we've positioned statements as a question. And it's probably the thing I coach to second most often, other than slowing down. And so what it sounds like is today I'm going to share with you some information about presence. I think you're going to find it really interesting. Some of you are going to be skeptical. And some of you are going to be really interested. And so what it sounds like is it's a question when in fact it's a statement. And I think it's another way that we unconsciously make that bid for connection, or it's a way to mitigate a possible perception of harshness. There is a belief that women do it more often than men. I would say there's truth to that to some extent. I do coach men on that pretty often as well. But I also find that Canadians do it more than Americans. And so when I'm working with American clients, some of them will still do it, but they don't do it to the same extent. And I think that's just a difference in culture. Canadians like to be very nice. We don't like to be too pushy. We don't like to be too bossy. Any other questions or comments? All right, then with that, I will encourage you to take these things away, to think about how you approach your next meeting, your next client interaction, your next meeting with your partner, with more presence, and to become more visible. So I can imagine I'll be seeing some of you. I won't be seeing you, but I'll be maybe imagining some of you doing some power posing before you go into those next important meetings. So thank you so much. And I'm supposed to remind you there is feedback sheets on the table. I also left a little basket at the back. If anybody is interested, you want to join my mailing list, I often send out articles when I've written articles. If you'd like to leave your card there, feel free to do so. No pressure. And that's all. Have a wonderful day.